Hello, Thaís Sky here. Welcome to Reclaim the Podcast. I'm so thrilled that you are here. Welcome to my home office. I really struggle with using my home office for my podcast because the lighting in here is not as good as my office. So bear with me. I'm trying to figure it out, but I wanted to get an episode out to you all this week because I think this is a really, really important topic that I've been wanting to talk about for a while. And so here we go. Let's get into this episode. I want to talk today about shame, the fear of being broken, this sense of badness. Sometimes we call that shame, sometimes we don't. But really, I want to speak to this deep, deep fear that I think many of us carry, that there's something really broken in us, and even more specifically than that there's something really bad about us. Like at the core of who we are bad. At the core of who we are, we're broken. At the core, we're rotten. At the core, we're a monster, right? We use different words, but I think we're saying something similar. What happens if it's true, right? What happens if that is the truth of who we are? And so if we carry around this fear, then of course, we're going to be trying to live our lives in such a way to make sure that that's not the truth. And also, if we are operating with this fear, we're going to be navigating our lives, being terrified of being found out and being terrified that somebody is going to see it and then we're going to get rejected because of it. So I want to talk about it because I think it can be fruitful for us to really start to investigate and interrogate what is it about this sense of badness? Why is it so crippling? Why does it really deteriorate our goodness? Why is it that it's so hard for us to hold our goodness when we're so overwhelmed by our badness? And what can we do about it? Yes? And this episode comes to you in part of my own personal experience and something that I've grappled with and navigated, but also because of a question. I love receiving questions from you all. It gives me a sense of where your mind is at, what you're struggling with. I really, really love it. And so I'm going to read the question that I received that inspired, that will inspire so much of what we talk about today. Okay, so here's the question. I'm so glad you're going to do a podcast episode on this topic, the topic of shame. I asked my Instagram audience what they thought of this topic. And so if you don't follow me on Instagram, go find me at I am Thaís Sky. I love engaging with all of you there. Okay. It's something I have been struggling with so much lately. My work friend recently got a promotion I have been fighting for, and all I want to do is be happy for her. But honestly, I feel so much envy and hatred, and I don't know what to do with these feelings, so I've been avoiding her, which then makes me so sad. I hate myself for not being able to be who I want to be for her, and I'm scared that this proves that I am bad and I am really broken. If you could talk about this, I would be so appreciative. This is a perfect example of what I mean. We have these really difficult feelings that in our culture, and for many of us growing up, there was no place for these feelings. Feelings of hatred. That is such a beautiful word because it so perfectly encapsulates a feeling, an experience, an internal experience that so many of us we're not given permission to experience. We're not given permission to have within ourselves. We weren't allowed to hate, particularly, right? We weren't allowed to hate our parents. Again, for most of us, we were supposed to then, because we weren't allowed to hate, because we weren't allowed to experience it, it didn't make the feelings go away, right? That's kind of at the core of what we know about the human experience, is that just because somebody tells you you shouldn't feel that way, or somebody tells you that that's a bad feeling to have, or whatever they say to you, it doesn't make the feeling go away. Feelings don't work like that. But what that does do when we are told that feelings such as hatred, another one is envy. Envy is such a beautiful word to describe such a difficult internal experience and internal feeling. And it's one of those words that is so hard to bear. Disappointment being another one, right? These words are so difficult to bear because it requires the person who's receiving it, who's hearing it, to tolerate it, to be able to hold it with you, right? Part of how we learn how to bear our feelings is by other people bearing it with us. So if we say to somebody like, I'm disappointed in you, and they're able to be like, oh, I hear that you're disappointed in me. Tell me more. I want to hear, I want to understand, I want to be with you in it. We then from that learn a couple of things. We learned that relationship is able to bear disappointment. But if we were children, if we're young, that teaches us that disappointment is bearable. And so if we have experiences like envy and hatred and nowhere to put these feelings, well, like I said, it doesn't make those feelings go away. What that does tell us is that there's no place for these feelings in the relationship. And so then what we try to do is we try to disconnect from them. We try to kind of push ourselves away from them. And so how we then, as children, for many of us, how we then tend to kind of orchestrate our mind around the fact that we're cutting off parts of ourselves is by then concluding that then it must mean that we're bad, right? So there's something that we're bad. So what I really appreciate about this question is that we're naming some really difficult emotions such as envy and such as hatred, and I'm going to add like disappointment. And because these feelings can be so hard to tolerate, then we go into it must then be that I shouldn't have these feelings. And if I shouldn't have these feelings, but I do have these feelings, then it must mean that I am bad. Something that I hope that you all have picked up from my podcast and from the ways in which I think about things. One, I'm not alone in how I think about things. Much of what I share here comes out of a lineage, comes out of people's wisdoms. It comes out of the ways in which humans have grappled with philosophy and psychology and sociology and how to be together, how to be human. And developmental psychology and how to understand ourselves from inception all the way to death, right? I mean, so I don't speak just out of nowhere. I speak out of expertise and experience. And in all of that, something that I have learned so innately within myself and within books and within what people have brought to this world is that emotions are relational. They don't exist alone within you, that emotions come out of the ways in which we are understanding other people and the ways in which other people are understanding us. This is important for this conversation of this fear of badness. So hold tight with me as we get there. Emotions are relational. When we feel a certain way about somebody, we're not just feeling it within ourselves, we're feeling it within a relational dynamic. We don't feel sad or hatred or envy out of nowhere. We feel it out of a relational experience. We're understanding something about the relationship through our emotions. This is why when we are very out of touch with our emotions, when we have a very hard time being with our emotions, what we also tend to do is we tend to also have a really hard time being in relationships, and we tend to have a hard time feeling connected to other people. Those things tend to go hand in hand. The more that we are able to be in touch with our emotional experience, the more that we'll actually find ourselves thriving in relationship, because so much of our emotional experience is learned out of relationships. Like I've been saying, something like hatred, something like envy, we learn to bear it, we learn to understand it as a relational dynamic through relationships, through our caregivers, helping us understand what these feelings are about. If we didn't have that, or if we had that in a very inconsistent way, or if we were told in certain words that certain feelings aren't acceptable, they don't go away. This is the theme of today's episode. They don't go away, they just go underground. And then we have to find all sorts of ways to make up for the fact that they went underground. We have to find ways to justify why they went underground. And the best way that we tend to find ourselves justifying it is those feelings are bad, and therefore I am bad for having those feelings. Yes, so getting into this question, I feel this stuff, okay? So this person is like in the next level. For many of us, we can't even acknowledge that we feel envy and hatred. Like even just acknowledging that we're having this experience towards somebody is really significant, because what most of us end up doing is we just find ourselves avoiding the friend. We find ourselves being busy. We find ourselves being uninterested. We find ourselves just, I'm just not interested in her that much. And it takes for some of us a little bit of digging to understand what shifted, like what changed between, feeling really close and connected to this person and feeling very distant. And then we have to kind of put the pieces together like, she just got this promotion that I wanted, and now I have certain feelings about it. So if you're feeling yourself really disconnected from your emotions and you're not even sure like why you're ignoring somebody, then step one is to begin to learn how to get in touch with your emotional experience so that you can get to the point where this question comes in, where it's like, wow, I know that I feel these things. I know that I'm feeling envy. I know that I'm feeling hatred, but I don't want to be feeling these things, and it's separating me from this person that I'm actually pretty proud of and pretty happy for and want this person to succeed. And that dissonance, right? That gap between like, I know that I shouldn't feel this way, or I know that I should be XYZ. I know that, but I'm not doing it, or I don't feel that way. That gap can elicit so much shame. In fact, some theories say that is exactly what shame is. Shame is the gap between where we are and what we think we should be. And in these types of situations, the difficulty is that we can get a sense that our feelings are actually getting in the way of the relationship in such a way that it's disconnecting the relationship. And then that can augment the shame, because we're like, this relationship means so much to me. I don't want to be separating. I can't help it that I'm having these feelings. I don't know what to do with these feelings because they're so uncomfortable and they're so big. And so I'm avoiding this person. But what I really want to be doing is happy for her. What an exquisitely difficult place to be in. And it really, to me, evokes so many moments in my life where I knew that I wanted to be supportive, or I knew that I wanted to be there for somebody, or I knew that this person was going through a hard time, and I really just wanted to be their support system. I just wanted to be there in like this way in which I envisioned, this fantasy of the way in which I wanted to be there for somebody. And yet there's this very real limitation that I'm experiencing, which is that I'm having these emotions, that I'm actually impacted by this in some sort of way. And while it may not be the same way that person is being impacted, I'm having all sorts of thoughts and feelings, and I don't know how to be in relationship and have these thoughts and feelings. And so we tend to avoid, or we devalue, we act out, we do all sorts of things. So I think the first thing that I would think about with this question, that if it were me, would be part of my grappling, would be part of my kind of own healing, would be to spend some time mourning and letting myself have all sorts of thoughts and feelings about the fact that I didn't get this promotion, right? The disappointment of not getting that promotion, the angst, how much you fought for it, how much you wanted it, how much that was important to you. There is a loss here. When we don't get something, we are now experiencing a loss of the fantasy that we had of that what would happen if we had gotten the thing. Oftentimes when we go after something, we go after a job or a raise or a relationship, so much of the impetus to go after it is a fantasy of what it will mean to get it, right? We kind of, in many ways, already construct this beautiful world where we are in this relationship, or we are in this job, or we are in this raise. It's part of desire. In desire comes world building. We build a whole world of what it would mean to get it. And I don't think that there's anything bad or wrong with that. I think it's part of what we do. But that does mean that when we don't get it, we're now having to mourn the loss of this thing that we envisioned we would now experience and aren't experiencing. Listen, so much of healing is grieving. So much of healing is coming to terms with the things that we didn't get and needed to get, or the things that we should have, that we did get that we shouldn't have gotten. So much of healing is grappling with loss. And so I think at the heart of this question, there is a loss, and I think that that's deserving of attention. Okay, so that's kind of like the first thing, and that may be exclusive to this question, but it may be more applicable than I'm giving myself credit. Maybe there's all sorts of ways in which, if you're experiencing shame, or if you're experiencing, again, that dissonance of like, this is the way I want to be responding, but I'm not responding, maybe in part of that, for all of us, is there some loss here? Is there something that I actually didn't get, and now I think it's worthwhile to let myself grieve, because that's step one. And going to the right people to grieve that loss usually doesn't, it's usually different people. For example, in this question, it wouldn't be the friend, right? It wouldn't be the colleague. It would be somebody else. Because going to the colleague wanting to mourn, I think would complicate this particularly tricky dynamic at this point in time. Not to say you could never say it or express it with them, but they just got something that you didn't get, and now you're grappling with the loss of that. I would bring that to some other relationship, therapist, coach, healer, whatever support system around you, your partner, whatever, to grapple with it first before bringing it to your friend. Okay. Okay. So once we do that, now we got to start to grapple with the envy and the hatred. And I think something that you may find as you let yourself grieve is that maybe some of that will dissipate. Maybe you'll notice that you won't quite feel as much hatred and envy for your friend when you give yourself space and time to grieve. But let's say that it doesn't. Let's say you do the grieving, you reckon with it. It's, you're doing that work, but you're also still navigating the envy and the hatred. Listen, it can be really, really hard when we want to be supportive for somebody, but it feels like it's threatening something within us. And I think a lot of times envy and jealousy come up because at the core of the experience is a deprivation. We feel in some ways deprived. We feel in some ways that this opportunity will never happen again, or it won't happen to us, or there's something wrong with us. And that can be really, really hard, because when we believe that to be true, and that there's limited resources, there's limited opportunities, and we're all fighting for very limited opportunities, then we're going to relate to people out of that place. And that can be really challenging, because I think when we're coming continuously into relationships feeling like we have to compete against each other, it's going to be very difficult for us to actually be in relationship with each other. And maybe that's a greater conversation that I can have on my podcast about, deprivation and the ways in which our capitalistic culture really perpetuates deprivation. It perpetuates a sense of lack. And I think it's maybe in some ways connected to the increased isolation and loneliness that so many of us are experiencing. Which could, we could argue can be connected to the increase in gun violence and all sorts of other kind of crises that is going on in our society. I think isolating is really, really damaging us as a whole. Okay, let me think. Let's back up a little bit and talk more about the badness. Because here's the thing that I think is really important for us to think about. When we're on our healing journey, we kind of fantasize that to heal, to tend to ourselves, to tend to our mental health, whatever language you're using, is to feel better about ourselves. And I think many of us hope that healing will give us a point of acceptance where we won't experience self-loathing anymore, and we won't experience self-hatred, and that we'll feel better, right? We'll feel better. I don't think that that's necessarily the case. I don't think that therapy is to help people feel better. I think the goal of therapy or healing is to help people feel better, to learn how to be better feelers, so to speak, another way of putting that. And so we want to be tender with this, because it's not that self-acceptance can't be part of our goal, or can't be part of something that we seek in our work. It's just that sometimes I think what we hope will happen is that we'll feel better about ourselves, and then won't really have to grapple with the ways in which we contribute to the hurt of other people. And so I think that that's a very popular narrative right now on Instagram and online and the internet, that we have to absolve us of our sins, right? What am I trying to say? That we're really, I think, trying to move away from self-loathing and self-hatred into self-acceptance. And the way that we're doing that is by trying to armor ourselves up in the sense of like, people are just mirrors and we can't really harm people because if we do, that's really on that. Like, we're trying to like obfuscate ourselves of the responsibility that we have for each other. And the truth of the matter is, I think what healing is about on a very high level, not just this, but one of the things is about courageously facing the suffering of others and how we may have contributed to that without collapsing into shame or a sense of badness. So I think we can really see that healing is taking place when we can hold on to our goodness, to the fact that at the core of us, like, we are good and we're capable of hurting people and we have to take responsibility for that without collapsing into, and then we are all bad. And I think in this way, in this way of thinking about it, collapsing into an all bad serves a purpose that I don't think is talked about enough, which is, I think when we collapse into badness, we're in some ways trying to anticipate other people's badness and control the narrative. So in that way, we're using our badness as a form of control. Like, if I can name and be like so overwhelmed in shame and so overwhelmed with how bad I am, then there's actually very little space in this relationship for you to tell me how I've wronged or how I've hurt or how I've did something to you. If I'm so overwhelmed with my badness, if I'm so I'm so like, oh my God, I feel so much shame, I'm so bad, then there's very little space for somebody else. Right? And I think in that way, what we're doing is we're trying to anticipate and then control. People can't tell us, listen, you hurt me, when I'm like, oh, but I already know. Oh, but I already know. One way that we see this is when we, sadly, this happens a lot in mother-daughter dynamics, but this actually can happen in all sorts of instances where you go to somebody and you say, hey, you hurt me. And then that person responds with something like, I was just doing the best that I could, I really tried to give you my all, and I'm sorry that wasn't enough for you. I really tried, I had a very limited upbringing, and I'm sorry that I'm so bad. I'm sorry that I'm such a bad mother. I really didn't mean to hurt you. Like, I am so bad. I'm so terrible. I can't even bear how terrible and bad I am. And I'm so sorry. And I please don't hate, right? Like that type of response. And for the person who just told that, the person A, right, who just said, hey, you hurt me, like, we instantly like regret saying anything because like now this person is so overwhelmed with shame and badness, and we're just like, oh my God, that's not what I wanted. What I wanted was for them to be able to say something like, oh my God, I hurt you. I want to hear more. I want to understand. I want to repair. I want to figure out, how we can bear this together because I hurt you. And that matters to me. And I did the best that I could, but it wasn't good enough for you in that moment. And that's something I now have to bear and have to grieve, and maybe also something that we can continue to talk about and be in together. Right? Those are very different responses. And the first response is such a beautiful example of this sense of like using our badness as a way to control, as a weapon in some ways, or as a protective mechanism, because now that person totally regrets saying anything and probably will not say anything again, but it doesn't actually help the relationship. It doesn't move the relationship forward in any meaningful way. No real repair is able to be taken place in a dynamic like that, because person B is just so flooded and so overwhelmed with badness, and rightfully so, right? Like they're not rightfully, what am I trying to say? They're so in touch with their badness, they've lost all sight of their goodness, and they lost all sight of the fact that they are still a person worthy of respect and worthy of goodness and are deserving and can hear that they did something that hurt without getting collapsed into badness. I mean, when we've lost ourselves and we're just all in the badness, it's like we're a big open wound, and it can be hard for people to relate to us. And so I'm not suggesting that this is an intentional or a manipulative kind of way to use our badness. Oftentimes I don't think that that's the intention of the people who are so flooded with badness and shame. I think I think what that really speaks to is such a fragile kind of sense of self, that they don't know anything else other than to get fully collapsed in their badness. But what we can see in that example is, if you identify as having done what person B does, is that unfortunately, while that may not be intentioned, it does serve as a way to control. It does serve as a way to push away, and it doesn't offer a space really for reconciliation, for correction, for accountability, for responsibility, and for repair, for moving forward in the relationship, as opposed to example B. Right? So we want to be really cognizant and thoughtful of how our badness may be a way that we're actually subtly distancing ourselves from really looking at the ways that we hurt people, which makes it difficult and brings us back to this question. It makes it difficult, though, in the moment when we are flooded with shame and with badness. And if I were to tell somebody, I wouldn't, right? I wouldn't do this. But if I were to tell somebody in that moment that they're so flooded with badness, like, hey, you're using your badness as a way to control and it's not actually helping, like, that would only further serve to further the shame and further the badness. So we don't want to be doing that. But what we do want to be doing is the work then of recovering our goodness, holding on to our goodness. And this goes back to, in some ways, if we're asking like, how do we do this? Through relationships where we can be reminded of our goodness. It's really, really important that if we learned of our badness through not enough containers, or through relationships that modeled or communicated in some ways that our feelings were not okay, or we shouldn't have those feelings, and because emotions are relational, then the ways in which we learn about our goodness, the ways in which we can anchor ourselves in the fact that we are good but we do bad things, right? We are good but we hurt people. We are good but there's sometimes a dissonance between what we know and how we're feeling. Like, if we can hold all of that in a goodness, that is also born out of relationships. And it can be really imperative for us to find places where we can grapple with our badness and grapple with our shame without people responding as if those things are the correct ways to experience it, but also not negate it. So, if a patient were to come to me and we were working together to navigate shame, my response would be like, oh, there's no point in you feeling shame, and maybe you're using shame. Like, I wouldn't go into some type of intellectual exercise. What we would do is we really carve more space for the shame to exist, for us to understand the shame, and for us to slowly and tenderly evaluate the ways in which we have erased our goodness in the overwhelm of the shame. And as we slowly do that work and anchor ourselves into our goodness, and we can do this in isolation too. I mean, it's not obviously as ideal, but we can find ways to self-care and self-soothe, and we can find ways to do the things that we love to do. We can find ways to read books we really enjoy, or journal. I mean, there's all sorts of ways that we need to tend to the shame first and foremost, because very little relating is going to happen while we're so flooded in the shame. Now, back to this question. Something that we certainly can do here and can be useful here is to say something to that friend along the lines of, I'm really proud of you. I'm thrilled for you. I know that you worked really hard for this promotion. This is so good. This is such a big deal. I'm having some of my own feelings about it that have really very little to do with you, and more to do with the fact that, I'm having a hard time holding, the fact that I'm disappointed and whatever. And so I'm getting a little, I would like to talk, I would just like for you to know, that's what I'm trying to say. There are ways in which sometimes just letting somebody know, hey, this is where I'm at, can be really profound in a relationship. It can be a way that people are saying, oh, so you're not just avoiding me, you're just struggling with something inside of you right now. But that really depends on the relationship. In this particular relationship, if it's a work colleague, it may not feel as You may not have the type of relationship where you may be interested in saying something like that. But avoiding doesn't work, right? Like, to avoid the person is only going to then augment the shame, because every time you avoid, you're going to be in touch with the ways in which your own feelings are what's driving a wedge between you and your friend. And so it's important, I think, to continue to face this within yourself and within the relationship. And let me tell you, Freud was the one who come up with this idea of like the id, the superego, and the ego, as like three parts of our mind that really hold a tension against each other, where the id wants to do all sorts of, like, has all these impulses and all these things and all these feelings, and the superego is like the critical inner parts of us that are trying to hold it all down, you know, trying to be like, no, but there are rules and there's ways of engagement, there's things, and then the ego is trying to hold these two things in place without it combusting our entire system. And it sounds a little bit like what's happening here, right? The id is the envy and the hatred. The superego is the ways in which you should feel. And then there's the grappling of like, how do I let there be space for all of these things? Finding places then where you can have all of the space to feel all of your hatred and all of your envy is a really important part of the process. Because again, part of the reason why we feel all this badness is because we've been told we can't feel these things. So finding places where you get to feel all these things, whether again, it's journaling, whether you're doing it alone or doing it in a relationship, like in therapy or in coaching or whatever, where you're able to say, oh, I hate her, and like really let yourself hate her and really let yourself want to destroy her and really like imagine, you know, and let yourself go, let your feelings like come out of you, really give in to them, because all you're doing is talking. You're not acting. You're not saying like, I hate her and so I'm now going to blank blank. This is not about decision. This is not about action. This is about letting yourself fully access these more primitive, younger, more raw emotions. Like, give into them. Let yourself feel them. The more you let yourself feel these things, the more they're going to get out, you know, out of you. And they're now going to be in a relationship. They're now going to be with the person that's listening to this. Again, if a patient came to me and was, you know, then I would be able to hold that hatred with her, with the patient, right? I would be able to be in it with this person. That's what we're talking about here. If badness comes from repression, then part of the goodness comes from expression. And that can feel counterintuitive when shame forces so much of us to be in repression, right? Shame exists in darkness. And so much of what gets alleviated in shame is bringing light to it, by talking about it, by giving it space, by realizing, oh, I'm not the only one that ever experienced hatred and envy in this in relationships, right? Like, you're not the only one who's like jealous that your coworker got a promotion. Like, the more we talk about it and shed light to it, the less space there is for shame. The more that we feel understood by people, the more we get to bring that goodness in. Yes, the sense of like, it's okay to have these feelings. The reason why they get so destabilizing and so overwhelming is because they exist in a secret. Because I believe in the narrative that having these feelings is bad, and that's just not true. Having these feelings is human. It's just a part of the human experience. Okay. So the question, right? I'm scared this proves that I really am broken. You're not broken. It can be helpful to think about it in a couple ways. Either like, you're not broken. You're just having a human experience, and like, the fact that so many emotions are coming up for you means that this is where the work lies. This is where the healing work lies. This is where attention is asking. There's a place within you that's asking for attention, and this is where beautiful work can be done in cultivating understanding of yourself and yourself in relationships, right? So you can think about it that way, like, you're not broken. This is just a sign of. Or you can think about it like, there is something that is broken. That is why it's so loud and so big and so painful, is because something got broken. And now this is your opportunity to repair and to heal. So much of how, like, we can learn so much about ourselves when we interrogate and investigate and examine the shame, rather than act as if that's the truth of who we are. Because shame is just like any other internal experience. It is just like any other internal experience. It's not the truth of who you are. But these things can be really hard to rewire and really hard to work with, because it can come from a really young place. And so the more that you get to understand, what exactly is going on in this dynamic with your friend, what is this stirring up? What is this bringing up that actually may have very little to do with this friendship and more to do with how you're understanding this relationship, can give you so much insight about then how to move forward with the relationship. And okay, so last thing, let's see. So let's be brave enough, right, to face the ways we may have disappointed ourselves, the way we may be disappointing ourselves, the way we may disappoint other people or have disappointed other people and those around us without collapsing into our badness. Like, let us be brave enough to do that. And where we cannot do that, where we do get overwhelmed with our badness, that is where the work lies. Let's see if there's anything else here. One of the things that I've experienced for myself in my own ways of navigating badness and moments when I was like, wow, I'm really not behaving the way I want to be behaving or I should be behaving, and therefore there's something really wrong with me. So much of the what has allowed me to then start to operate from the place that I want is literally just giving space to the ways in which I'm not. And I feel like I represent this in my mind. Part of my message, part of what I advocate for quite fiercely on my podcast and on my Instagram and in all sorts of ways is that so often we think that psychological health comes from action and behavior modification. We really believe that the only way to change circumstance is to take action and to do something. And I'm not convinced that that's true. And I've actually experienced personally and witnessed this happen in other people, that sometimes the very act of just talking about it and understanding it in ourselves and cultivating insight and having a different emotional experience with another person can change something in us that allows us to see things differently, that then allows different options and different possibilities and different ways of acting that were unavailable to me before. And so I'm not convinced that the fullness of healing lies in doing it differently. I think the fullness in healing lies in being experienced differently, and experiencing ourselves differently. And from there, so much action that we then can take feel like they are coming from a genuine part of ourselves instead of forcing ourselves to just do something different. I'm not saying all of this. I'm not saying that this is true all the time for every scenario, but I do think we're such a culture of action, that we just have to do it differently, just force yourself to do it differently. And I'm interested in a different approach. I'm interested in a different way of landing within ourselves and landing within our world. I'm interested in an experience where simply by continuing to shed light on what hurts changes, rather than to do all these things as if we don't hurt, hoping that changes the hurt. So for this question, for example, I feel like I'm more inclined to say to give yourself space to have your feelings. Talk about them with people that can hold those feelings without exacerbating the shame or telling you that you're wrong or trying to convince you that your feelings are right, because that's not the answer either, right? And we want to be careful with that. How often do we talk to people who we know will then be like, yeah, you should be mad at her. Wow, that was a shitty thing that she did, right? And like exacerbate our anger, which then further serves to divide. Because we don't know, we can get very righteous, and when we get righteous, we harden. We can't really be righteous and be in relationship and be in connection. And there may be something here for the two of you to think about. Like, did you know that she was going after the same promotion as you? Was it something you two talked about? Did you two talk about what it would mean for the relationship if one of you got the promotion or not? And if not, if it came out as a surprise, right? If like your boss just bestowed loaded upon her, then she may have all sorts of thoughts and feelings about getting it and you not getting it. Did she know that you wanted it? I mean, there's all sorts of fruitful conversations that could be taking place. But when we get righteous, like, oh, I should feel this way, I should feel this way because what she did, then we start to lose sight of what healing looks like, which is not actually righteous, but to soften into our feelings, let our feelings move through us, let our feelings cultivate deeper understanding and insight so that we can move towards connection. And so here, there may be an opportunity to feel hurt by her if she went behind your back, and that's something that the two of you can talk about, but that's still not a righteousness, right? So let's think carefully about who we go to for emotional support, because having people exacerbate our righteousness does not actually foster, I think, what we want to foster. We want to be careful with righteousness because it can really serve to separate and to harden us against the world. And I don't think that that's what we're really seeking. I think what we're really seeking is connection and to be seen in our hurt. Okay, so I think that's all I want to say about this topic. I hope that it was additive to you and useful for you. Thank you for being here. If you're watching this on YouTube, welcome. Please like, subscribe, whatever you're supposed to do on YouTube. And if you're listening to this wherever you listen to your podcasts, just know that I do have a YouTube channel now where I'm videoing these episodes, so you can watch me if you like to watch somebody talk instead of just listen. You can go to my YouTube. The link is in the show notes. I'm so thrilled that you're here. If the podcast has meant anything to you over the years, I would really appreciate a review. These things mean the world for the algorithms. You know how these things go. Thank you for being here, and I will talk to you all soon.